Good evening and welcome to Gibson's Bookstore Remote. I am Elizabeth from Gibson's Bookstore, and we are very pleased to partner tonight with one of our partners in the before, as I like to say. Jimmy Pappas is from the Poetry Society of New Hampshire. We used to have readings of their poetry in our store every month, if not more. And we're so pleased to be presenting this program tonight with Charles Simic, presented by the Poetry Society of New Hampshire. The Charles books are available from Gibson's Bookstore, and we do have a nice stack of signed book plates that we would be happy to include with any purchase of Charles's books from Gibson's. We have, you can browse in store, you can give us a call on our phone, or you can shop online. We do have curbside pickup and shipping. We're very pleased to have you here tonight. Jimmy, Charles, please take it away.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'm going to begin with a bit of an introduction here. Charles Simic began his life trying to survive World War II, and he wrote a bit about the indiscriminate bombing that occurred, and he's been a speaker out against that. I know a little about that because I was in Vietnam, and I know a lot of veterans and peoples that were there and the books I read. So it still goes on today, in Syria and other places, and it just seems like a hard thing to get people to stop. Today is the anniversary of the day Russian soldiers drove the Nazis out of his hometown of Belgrade, Yugoslavia. And he remembered that, is why he chose this day. He would later flee to Chicago, and he said his travel agents were Hitler and Stalin, like Nazis and communists, drove him to America. He showed an interest in poetry in high school, and that led him to winning the Pulitzer Prize in 1990 for The World Doesn't End. That was his Pulitzer Prize winner. He had a couple of finalists for the Pulitzer Prize. His first collection of collected poems, and Unending Blues was another one that was a finalist for the Pulitzer. I have a huge stack of Mr. Simic's books, and I really love going through them. I believe in like immersing yourself in a poet, and trying to read as much as you can until you really get to know them. I told him I think I know him better than he does. And so in 2007, he became the 5th U.S. Poet Laureate, and he's taught at UNH for about 45 years. I'm not sure how many people are here of his former students, but certainly if anyone is, I can jot in a little hello as being someone who knew him from a classroom. Now, the first thing we're going to do is look at his collection of poems that he selected to read today, which I'm going to screen share for him right now. So, Charlie, the first poem here is Shelly.
Shelly. I want to say something about that poem. The poem, I wrote this poem, I think maybe 1969, 1970, I don't know, maybe even later. But the events that I describe in the poem take place in New York City in the fall of 1959. As Jimmy said, I was in Chicago. I had lived in New York when we came to the United States briefly, and always wanted to come back to New York. And I got there in the fall of 1959 and realized that I hardly know any people there, and I didn't have a job. I didn't have money to go to the university. So I was very lonely, especially that first fall in New York. And so the poem takes place in the fall of 1959. Shelly, the great romantic poet, British romantic poet. I had read him before some of the poems, but this is the day that I kind of read an entire little collection of Shelly's. Anyway, here's the poem. Shelly. Poet of the dead leaves, driven like ghosts, driven like pestilence-stricken multitudes, I read you first one rainy evening in New York City, in my atrocious Slavic accent, saying the mellifluous verses from a battered, much-stained volume I had bought earlier that day in a second-hand bookstore on 4th Avenue, run by an initiate of the occult masters. The little money I had being almost spent, I walked the streets, my nose in the book. I sat in a dingy coffee shop with last summer's dead flies on the table. The owner was an ex-sailor who had grown a huge hump on his back while watching the rain, the empty street. He was glad to hear me sit and read. He'd refill my cup as a liquid dark as river Styx. Shelley spoke of a mad, blind, dying king, of rulers who neither see nor feel nor know, of graves from which a glorious phantom may burst to illumine our tempestuous day. I too felt like a glorious phantom going to have my dinner in a Chinese restaurant I knew so well. It had a three-fingered waiter who would bring my soup and rice each night without ever saying a word. I never saw anyone else there. The kitchen was separated by a curtain of glass beads which clicked faintly whenever the front door opened. The front door opened that evening to admit a pale little girl with glasses. The poet spoke of the everlasting universe of things, of gleams of a remoter world which visit the soul in sleep, of a desert peopled by storms alone. The streets were strewn with broken umbrellas which looked like funereal kites this little Chinese girl might have made. The bars of McDougal Street are emptying. There had been a fist fight. A man leaned against a lamppost, arms extended as if crucified, the rain washing the blood off his face. In a dimly lit side street, where the sidewalk shone like a ballroom mirror at closing time, a well-dressed man without any shoes asked me for money. His eyes shone. He looked triumphant, like a fencing master who had just struck a mortal blow. How strange it all was, the world's raffle, that dark October night. The yellowed volume of poetry with its splendors and glooms, which I studied by the light of storefronts, drugstores and barbershops, afraid of my small windowless room, cold as a tomb of an infant emperor. The next one is called The Infinite. This is one of those poems I have absolutely no idea. I mean, how I made a connection. I mean, the infinite is such an abstract term. We cannot conceive, visualize the infinite. And I wanted to sort of bring it down to words, as it were. But if I remember correctly, this was written very quickly. The infinite. The infinite yawns and keeps yawning. Is it sleepy? Does it miss Pythagoras, the sails on Columbus's 3 ships? Does the sound of the surf remind it of itself? Does it ever sit over a glass of wine and philosophize? Does it peek into mirrors at night? Does it have a suitcase full of souvenirs stashed away somewhere? Does it like to lie in a hammock with the wind whispering sweet nothings in its ear? Does it enter empty churches and light a single candle on the altar? Does it see us as a couple of fireflies playing hide and seek in a graveyard? Does it find us good to eat? This next poem has a strange story, how it came. Uh, I was waiting for somebody in New York in an Italian restaurant called Cafe Paradiso, which is the title of the poem. And the person who was supposed to join me was late. And I had nothing to read. You know, those were the days when I didn't have a cell phone, you know. So I kept reading the menu over and over and over again. Look, as you see, it's a very attractive menu. So this is where the poem began, and most of the stuff in the poem is what the stuff was on the menu. So, Cafe Paradiso. My chicken soup thickened with pounded young almonds, my blend of winter greens. Dearest tagliatelle with mushrooms, fennel, anchovies, tomatoes, and vermouth sauce. Beloved monkfish braised with onions, capers, and green olives. Give me your tongue tasting of white beans and garlic. Sexy little assortment of formaggi and fruta. I want to drown with you in red wine like a pear, and sleep in a Macedon of wild berries. This next poem is New York City poem. Actually, I should mention that the other person who's dead, it's a kind of a homage. It's a kind of it's about my father. The friends of Heraclitus. Your friend has died without whom you roam the streets. Oh, sorry. The friends of Heraclitus. Your friend has died with whom you roam the streets at all hours, talking philosophy. So today you went alone, stopping often to change places with your imaginary companion, and argue back against yourself on the subject of appearances, the world we see in our heads, and the world we see daily, so difficult to tell apart when grief and sorrow bow us over. You too often got so carried away, you find yourself in strange neighborhoods, lost among unfriendly folk, having to ask for directions while on the verge of a supreme insight, repeating your question to an old woman or a child, both of whom may have been deaf and dumb. What was that fragment of Heraclitus you were trying to remember as you stepped on the butcher's cat? Meantime, you yourself were lost between someone's new black shoe left on the sidewalk and the sudden terror and exhilaration at the sight of a girl dressed up for a night of dancing, speeding by on roller skates. Sunday papers. The butchery of the innocent never stops. That's about all we can be ever sure of love. Even more than the roast you're bringing out of the oven. It's Sunday. The congregation files slowly out of the church across the street. A good many carry Bibles in their hands. It's the vague desire for truth and the mighty fear of it that makes them turn up despite the glorious spring weather. In the hallway, the old mutt just now had the honesty to growl at his own image in the mirror before lumbering to the kitchen with the lamb roast set in your outstretched hands, smelling of garlic and rosemary. the week. Monday comes around with a new tattoo he won't show us. And here is Tuesday, walking its latest nightmare on a leash. And Wednesday, blind as the rain tapping on a window pane. And Thursday, sipping bad coffee served by a pretty waitress. Friday, lost in the confusion of sad and happy faces. And Saturday, flashing like a pinball machine in the morgue. And Sunday, with the head of crucified Christ hanging sideways, bathroom mirror. This next one is also autobiographical. It's dedicated to memory of San Francisco poet George Oppen, so-called objectivist. He was a movement called objectivism. Maureen Lydecker, Karl Rakosi, and George Oppen, Kowski. And I lived in those days. I was teaching in Hayward, across the bay, in California, and I used to go with my wife and visit George Oppen in San Francisco. He was a delightful fellow, he and his wife. I mean, you could come any time of the day or night, and they would welcome you. I mean, there was always somebody at their house, and so it was really very lovely being with him. I mean, he knew all those poets in the 30s, you know, sort of like Ezra Pound, and I would ask him questions, and then he died. He was old, and I came back to San Francisco from New Hampshire, and made a kind of a tour of that neighborhood, and the poem "The Tiger" came out of that. In San Francisco that winter, there was a dark little store full of sleepy Buddhas. The afternoon I walked in, no one came out to greet me. I stood among the sages as if trying to read their thoughts. One was huge and made of stone. A few were the size of a child's head and had stains the color of dried blood. There were even some no bigger than mice, and they appeared to be listening. The winds of March, black winds, the gritty winds the dead poet wrote. At sundown, his street was empty, except for my long shadow, open before me like scissors. There was his house where I told the story of the Russian soldier, the one who looked Chinese. He lay wounded in my father's bed, and I brought him water and matches. For that, he gave me a little tiger made of ivory. Its mouth was open in anger, but it had no stripes left. There was a night when I colored its eyes black, its tongue red. My mother held a lamp for me while worrying about the kind of luck this beast might bring us. The tiger in my hand growled faintly when we were alone in the dark. But when I put my ear to the poet's door that afternoon, I heard nothing. The winds of March, black winds, gritty winds, he once wrote. The next poem is one of the earliest poems I wrote in New Hampshire. I taught for 3 years in California and Hayward, Cal State Hayward, and then UNH hired me. So this is like, I got there in 73, so this is probably 75, 76. The Vietnam War is still on. And the Poet Laureate took down Hall and Jenkins toward nightfall. The weight of tragic events on everyone's back, just as tragedy in the proper Greek sense was thought impossible to compose in our day. There were scaffolds, makeshift stages, puny figures on them, like small, indistinct animals caught in the headlights crossing the road way ahead. In the gray twilight, they went on hesitating on the verge of a huge, starless autumn night. One could have been in the back of an open truck hunkering because of the speed and chill. One could have been walking with a sidelong glance at the many troubling shapes the bare trees made, like those about to shriek, but finding themselves unable to utter a word now. One could have been in one of these dying mill towns, beside a small, dim grocery when the news broke. One would have drawn near the radio with the one many months pregnant who serves there at that hour. Was there a smell of spilled blood in the air, or was it that other, much finer scent of fear, the fear of approaching death one met on the empty street? Monsters on many posters, too, prominently displayed. Then 6 factory girls, arm in arm, laughing as if they'd been drinking. At the very least, one could have been one of them. The one with a mouth painted bright red who feels out of sorts, for no reason very pale, and so, excusing herself, vanishes where it says rooms for rent, then immediately goes to bed fully dressed, only to lie with eyes open, trembling despite the covers. It's just a bad chill, she keeps telling herself, not having seen the papers, which the landlord has the dog playing from the front porch. The old man never learned to read well, and so reads in that half whisper and in that half light verging on the dark about that day's tragedies, which supposedly are not tragedies in the absence of figures endowed with classic ability of soul. Ghost ship. Those blessed moments that pretend they'll stay with us forever, soon gone without a fare thee well. What's the rush? I heard myself say. You have the right to remain silent, the night told me as I sat in bed hatching plans on how to hold the next chapter in my head. I recall a window thrown open one summer day and a grand view of the bay, and a cloud in all that blue, as pale as the horse death likes to ride. Always happy to shoot the breeze, that long cloud was telling me as it drifted out to sea, toward some ship on the horizon that had already set sail and was about to vanish out of sight. On the way to some port, and country without name. A ghost ship, more surely, but mine all the same. Here is a New Hampshire poem. It's called So Early in the Morning. It pains me to see an old woman fret over a few small coins outside a grocery store. How swiftly I forget her as my own grief finds me again. a friend at death's door, and the memory of the night we spent together. I had so much love in my heart afterward, I could have run into the street naked, confident anyone I met would understand my badness and my need to tell them about life being both cruel and beautiful. But I did not, despite the overwhelming evidence. A crow bent over a dead squirrel in the road. The lilac bushes flowering in some yards. And the sight of a dog free from his chain, searching for a neighbor's trash. Thank you. I can't hear you. Hello?
Sorry, my mover was stuck there. It wouldn't go. Sorry.
Okay.
I apologize for that. And there I'm talking to nobody myself. All right, so people can put some questions on the chat if they like, and I had a couple that were sent to us, and this one I think is one of my favorite stories is the one you told about looking for food imagery with Mark Strand, and that poem Cafe Paradiso that you just read. I think
that would qualify.
Yeah, that would definitely qualify.
Yeah.
Would you like to share that story again?
Well, I mean, what it was, I mean, this was back in, my God, this would be probably in the 60s in New York. And, you know, there were all kinds of poetry movements. There were deep image poets. There were, you know, Black Mountain poets. I mean, it was just confessional poets, on and on and on. So Strand and I, we didn't have a movement. I mean, we were just, you know, without movement, that we didn't want to join any of these movements. So one day, because I'm reading, and I forget who read. I mean, it was a kind of a group reading. And what we noticed afterwards, there were people, it was not a sophisticated audience that was attending this reading, but anyway, anytime some kind of food was mentioned, they laughed. I mean, some poems, there's a line of poems, eating a hot dog. They go, ha! You know, anything else, you know, eating a bag of chips or whatever. So we said, you know, this is really interesting. This is a food mention, rare mentions of food, where, you know, getting a lot of applause. So we said, let's try to write poetry. We'll call the movement gastronomic poetry. And what we'll do is we'll write poems about food. You wrote a very good poem about pot roast. And, but you know, either the whole poem about particular food or mention food in a poem that has nothing to do with food. And we had this kind of wonderful fantasies. The poems would be very popular with mothers who had children who were slow eaters, you know, don't like spinach or whatever, you know, so we all these poems that mention some of these things. And, you know, it was really kind of a gag. I mean, it wasn't really serious. But yes, I mean, when you know, Cafe Paradiso was just perfect. I mean, you know, create a love poem out of a menu in a restaurant.
Yeah, I can almost smell it, you know, and taste it almost when you use those words. Really, it really does have an effect on the reader, I think.
Yeah.
There was a question that was sent to me before this, one by Meg Kearney and Jennifer Militello, and they're very similar, the two questions. Meg talked about poetry as political resistance, and Jennifer Militello talked about the future of poetry and all this turmoil that's going on, and if it's going to be changing at all with that.
Well, I mean, as you can see, I mean, poets are continue to have poetry readings, which surprised me. I thought, well, I mean, inevitably that just theater is pretty much dead. There are no more jazz clubs, or nightclubs, comedy clubs, you name it. But I mean, I've had quite a few readings since the pandemic started. Some of them in South America and in Europe. So as far as that, I mean, it's continuing. On the other hand, books are selling very badly because I mean, most of the bookstores are closed. And but as far as poetry, I mean, the subject of poetry and so forth, I mean, inevitably there will be poems about our present situation or predicament. And the thing about poetry is that poetry has survived so many awful periods in history. It will survive. I mean, I'm not worried about that. But it's difficult to predict, predict what poetry will be like. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I imagine that there will be, the kind of suffering coming from the coronavirus, the deaths and so forth. I mean, some of that will enter. Also, political poems. I mean, there are many more political poems being written now. Previous we had long periods when now there wasn't a single political poem. There were plenty of political poems during the Vietnam War, but it's. I mean, I don't have a,
Right. I think sometimes we want to just write about potatoes and palm trees and things, but we maybe feel this pressure like we have to respond to the things that are happening. I don't know.
Yeah.
Sam DeFitch wanted to know about a poem that was in Three Penny Review called "The Wind Has Died," and he's really fascinated with your extremely short poems. How do you go about an extremely short poem? Can that be really difficult since there's so few words? Is that a difficult process to create a really short poem?
Well, it is because you cannot write a short poem. I mean, you can't say, I'm going to write a poem of 4 lines. And then you write the first line, you say, yeah, this is not very good. You can't. I mean, you can't write a short poem because, I mean, any poem to work as a poem needs something unpredictable. I mean, it's sort of, you have to make connections between, well, you think of haikus, the way the haikus are, the way, association that is so unexpected. For example, there's a poem, I think it's by Isa, the great master, where he says something like, geese flying overhead. And then he says next, no blanket can cover them now. Fall, geese flying, no blanket can cover them now. And you just sort of, it's incredible, I mean, the association. So I think short poems are discovered in something that's much longer. You have fragments of poems that didn't work out, but I decided to copy some lines in my notebooks, and then years go by, and suddenly you see what needs to be done, what you take out and what you keep, and I mean I usually can remember, roughly how the poem started, what I in my other poems, what I did, what I was thinking of. But these things are totally without history. You just say to yourself, I discovered this. Oh my God, how did this come about? But I'm alert. I pay attention. When I see, when I go through my notebooks. If I see something that suddenly, inspires me, really to do pruning, to cut, to leave things out. So that's how I write short poems.
And Jewel Davis said she loved your, or I guess she loved your poem, The Fork. I assume that has a history, and I love that letter that you received about why is a nice guy like you writing about forks and knives and spoons.
Yeah, I mean, it was, it really annoyed me. I mean, it was a jerk. I mean, that guy. I met he was Ted Weiss, poet, at this magazine in Princeton. This is back in the college in the 60s. I mean, you know. But I met him later on. He was a really nice guy. I never told him about that, but he wrote me, you know. But how did I write those poems? You know, when you're young and, you know, so this was, you know, I started 65 years ago, you know, writing blogs and being interested in poetry. And there was, you know, there was so much interesting stuff to read, you know, American poetry and, of course, beyond poetry, South American poetry. And you want to do something original. And I sort of remember it was fall. Oh my God, what fall was it? I mean, it had to be in the early 60s, I think. Even earlier, but whatever it is, I was living on 13th Street, East 13th Street in New York, and one day I came home and I worked at NYU. I had an office job and went to school at night. I came home and to eat something, and the utensils that I had, you know, the fork, knife, and spoon, were actually, I didn't ever bought them. I just, you know, picked them up in some greasy spoon. You know, I grabbed these things and brought them home. You know, it was before. And I was sitting there, and I guess I didn't have much to eat or anything, but I looked at them and they looked so interesting as objects. I mean, they clearly had history, you know. And so it occurred to me, I mean, you know, people use forks, knives, and spoons every day, most of them, you know. And there's got to be something to say about about them, you know, to describe them. And I think the fork is the most successful. The spoon got a little bit too long. The knife is actually the longest, but fork was I think the most successful.
This book here that I bought once at one of your presentations, one of your collections, and you had an inscription in it, which I think is pretty interesting. It says, "Why poetry? To remind people of their humanity." And I think you have a story behind that quote.
Yeah, I mean, that quote I got from somebody, from a high school girl in El Paso. I think I was sent in one of these, the government had the poets in schools. And there was a tour that started in Tucson and went down to the Mexican border, the Indian reservation, and then into New Mexico, a few towns in New Mexico, mostly along the border. And finally to a school in El Paso, a big high school. Mexico, you know, here's the playground on the other side of Mexico. And, you know, these schools, I ask you to do like 6 or 7 classes. You know, you show up there and then you basically teach all day. And every day, that many classes, plus you have to do the driving between places, and some of the places are very distant from one another. So this is my last class in El Paso. And, you know, gotta go out there and get a huge tequila, you know. And so, you know, at the end of the class, you usually ask, you know, for questions. And So somebody asked me, a student I know, I think it was a boy. Yeah, it was a boy. He said, "What is poetry good for?" Which is a great question. A very, I was so tired. I mean, I couldn't talk anymore. So I was there, thinking, a hand goes up in the class, and I still remember the way she looked, all dressed in black, a good Catholic Mexican girl, very properly dressed. And I said, "Do you have an answer?" She says, "Yes." She says, "To remind people of their humanity." And I was stunned. It was such a fantastic reply. And I wanted to, run and grab her and say, "Who are you? What's your name? How did you get that?" But as I said, this is the last class of the day, and the explosion over there, all the students from all the classes running into the hallway. I could never catch up with her. So that was that. I mean, that was the end of that thing, but I always remember that. I liked it. So I put in the book.
Yeah, that's a great line. I always ask the writers to write something interesting, and when I ask them to sign their name rather than just a name.
Yeah.
Caitlin Bucksbaum from Alaska. She's a young poet. She wants to know if you have any advice. You probably get this question a lot. How do you advise a young poet? And do you have memories of being a young poet yourself?
Well, I mean, it's pretty much the same thing. I mean, it's you read a lot of poetry, you find out what kind of poetry there is out there, and there's a very different kinds of poetry. And you read some poet, and they influence you a great deal. You just love them, and inevitably you start imitating them, and then you find something else, and then you imitate that. I mean, you learn. I've learned. I mean, by being influenced greatly by a whole bunch of poets, and it's. I mean, I have poems that I didn't really republish, early poems, and I can see, who the influences are. For example, one of my first influence was Hart Crane. What I liked about Hart Crane, it was so obscure. I mean, he had a fantastic vocabulary, He looked in a thesaurus, he find a word that's totally esoteric, And so I wrote incomprehensible poems for a while, and I got tired of that. But yeah, so it's like that. I mean, you meet other people who are interested in poetry, or nowadays, people go to college and take a grade running class. Right? You need somebody to read your poems, just a friend. I mean, and to tell you, bluntly, I mean, exactly what they think. I remember once I showed some poems to a guy who was much older than me. He was a painter. And he looked at the poems, he read the poems. I think he came up with 4 or 5 poems. This was in Greenwich Village, New York, and he said to me, looked at me kind of, actually for the first time. I was just a different, I think he was 20 years older than I was. So he looked at me and he said, "Simic, I thought you were a smart guy. This is real shit." And so I remember walking out. This was down on Varick Street, and all the way down, past the village, South Village, and Canal Street. And I went out and started walking uptown, thinking like, he's right. He is full of shit, No, I like this, going back and forth in my mind, And finally, I came to where, and I was on 59th Street, just crossing the street to go into Central Park. I didn't notice any of this. So this is what happened. This is good. It's the best thing ever happened to me. It was wonderful.
Great. I find it hard sometimes. You can tell which people can handle a criticism and which can't. Sometimes I find you just have to tell them it's great. I don't know. Beverly Perez Rigo wants to know your favorite Latin American poets.
Oh, a lot of poets. I mean, I think well, I mean, they're very new. We all read Neruda. I mean, I even met once Neruda and had lunch with him, and the American poet Laureate Consultant. For me, Vallejo. Vallejo was the most influential. I mean, no, I should say, I mean, I should also mention Neruda. I mean, there's some early poems in mine that are so influenced by Neruda that it's embarrassing. But Vallejo, and I mean, there was a gorgeous anthology of South American poetry that was published by New Direction and never reprinted before. It was done during the Second World War. It was just called Latin American poetry, the biggest ever. And it was done during the war, and for copyright reasons, was never republished. It was a great book. I mean, there's so many poets there, from the Caribbean, from Mexico, from all the way down to Argentina, of course, and big book of maybe 400 pages. So I read that book millions of times.
And Christopher Klaus has kind of a long question, like some of the significant shifts you're seeing in your poetry as your work has evolved. Are there been changes going along through your life, through different periods of your life? And are things where you feel you've done better, or things that have faded away, things that you wish could come back, as far as your whole life of poetry, how it's changed along the way?
Well, you know what? I've always been influenced by the events in the world. I mean, I grew, as you mentioned, up during the Second World War, and I mean, I never forgot that war. I mean, in those years of bombings and people hanging from lampposts and so forth. So that left a tremendous influence on me. I mean, Second World War. But since I was a kid, I mean, so I was born in 1938. I mean, there have been so many other wars, and I remember the United States. I mean, I came to the United States 1954. I had in 55 we were in Chicago, and in 56 I got a job after finishing high school. Chicago sometimes. I worked in what was it kind of nothing. I mean, just a kind of an office, and so I used to go down to print where the print shop was, where they had all they were printing the paper, and because that's what they had, like they had coffee and donuts and stuff like that. So that was a Saturday, kind of a quiet day in the newspaper. I went down there, and all those guys who worked down there knew me, and said to me, "Hey, Simic, you're going to Lebanon." Yeah. He says, "Didn't you read the papers? I mean, they're drafting everybody to go to Lebanon. There was a Marines were sent to Lebanon. There was some kind of a thing. This is 1956, I guess." And I was thinking, like, oh my God, I mean, I just went through one war. I mean, what's Lebanon? I never had anything against the Lebanese. I mean, being terrified. But as you know, I mean, we had Vietnam War. My brother was in Vietnam. I mean, I was in the army. I mean, so just scary stuff. So those kind of things affected me great deal.
Yeah, a lot of people looked at your bookshelves behind you, and they're trying to pick out if they some of the books, and if there's they're wondering kind of what you read, or if there's any poets you're looking at right now, type of thing.
Oh, my books are, I have so many books that they are really hysterical. My wife can find them. But if I'm looking for a book, she can find, I can't find anything anymore. I had to write about certain books, certain writers on New York Review of Books, because I wrote for 20 years ago, reviews. And I couldn't find the book, so I had to buy the book. The book that I knew I had, because there's so many books. I read everything. I mean, I read, of course, a lot of poetry. I read fiction. I read history. I read, the classics. I mean, I love the Greek and Roman classics, and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I noticed that in reading some of your stuff that, I mean, there's art. So, Catherine O'Brien asked about art because you've written about, I think, Joseph Cornell and right. And you also, like, this is Vasco Popa, and you translate it, so you do translations as well. And I get to learn some really new writers from Eastern Europe, reading through some of your stuff. I really love this book, your translation of Vasco Popa. And I recommend it. That was different. He didn't seem, as you mentioned, he didn't seem to have any influences. So it was kind of like, it's so different from everybody else, his poetry.
Well, this man, I used to know this man, Vasco Popa, which older than I was in a different generation, but he knew, for example, the French surrealists. So he told me about surrealists, and he really was somebody one could ask all sorts of questions and about poetry. It was very, very interesting. And I think early on I was influenced by him. He had poems, sequence of poems about pebbles. I wrote a poem about a stone, and there were a few other inanimate objects. In his poetry, my poetry, but he himself got it from the surrealists, and was influential.
Yeah, I recommend it. It was a very great read. Are you feeling okay, Charlie? Are you coming to the end of the time, do you think, or do you want a few more questions? Or
No, a few more questions.
Okay, you've done a great job, I feel. Your relationship with art, Catherine O'Brien, when she talked about that, do you study a lot of art? Are you very knowledgeable about art and artists?
Well, I'm not really that knowledgeable. I used to be. I started as a painter. The first thing I did when I was in high school, I started drawing. Essentially, I spent a year in Paris before we came to the United States. And I started drawing. The first thing I started drawing were American cars, parked Buick or a Cadillac or a Dodge. And but then I started doing watercolors, and later on, especially when I came to Chicago, and I was in high school, I was really painting a lot. Oils, watercolors, and when you start, want to be a painter, you have to look at a lot of painting. And the great thing about Chicago was a fantastic public library, and I discovered that you take art books home. So these big, heavy art books, you take them home and you look at art. So, art has been very, very important. And I painted till I was about almost 30. But the circumstances, living in one room, apartments, hotel rooms were very difficult to paint. And So that was it.
Yeah, you know, I volunteer at a library. We have all these old giant art books like you talked about. We want parents to just take them, let the kids cut out the pictures or whatever, just to learn art. They're right there for free if they want them. Yeah. All right, well, I think we've reached our kind of a limit time here, and I've really enjoyed talking with you, Charlie, and I think the group has too. So I want to thank you for being with us today.
Well, thank you all for asking questions and coming, and I really enjoyed it.
So thank you everybody for joining us this evening. Charles, thank you so much for joining us through the screen. Jimmy, thank you so much for offering us this event to partner again on poetry. We are so pleased. We are working on more events to come. Hanif Abdurraqib is on Friday. We are very pleased about that. Thank you to everybody who's joined us in the chat asking questions. Charles' books are available from Gibson's Bookstore, and we are happy to slip those signed book plates into those books as well. I've seen a couple of orders come through the website during this event, which is fantastic. Thank you very much, everybody joining us. Have a great night.
You too. Good night.